Elena Martinez stood outside the massive iron gates of the Blackwood mansion, her worn duffel bag clutched tightly in her weathered hands. The September morning was crisp, and the golden sunlight reflected off the countless windows of the sprawling estate that stretched before her like a small city. She had seen pictures of wealthy homes before, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer magnitude of the Blackwood family residence. The mansion rose 4 stories into the sky, its limestone facade decorated with intricate carvings and surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that seemed to go on forever. Fountains sparkled in the distance, and she could see tennis courts, a swimming pool that looked more like a small lake, and what appeared to be a stable in the far corner of the property. Elena took a deep breath and pressed the intercom button beside the gate. A crisp voice answered immediately. "State your business, please." "Elena Martinez. I'm here for the housekeeping position. Mrs. Harrison is expecting me." The gates swung open silently, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. Elena walked slowly up the path, her simple black shoes clicking against the cobblestones. She had worked as a maid and housekeeper for 15 years, but never in a place like this. The Blackwood family was one of the wealthiest in the country, with business interests spanning technology, real estate, and international trade. As she approached the main entrance, massive wooden doors carved with the family crest opened to reveal a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. Mrs. Harrison, the head housekeeper, wore a pristine gray uniform and carried herself with the dignity of someone who had managed wealthy households for decades. "Ms. Martinez, welcome. Please, come in." Elena stepped into the foyer and nearly gasped. The ceiling soared 3 stories above her head, supported by marble columns. A crystal chandelier the size of a small car hung overhead, casting rainbow patterns across the polished floor. Oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. "The estate employs 37 staff members," Mrs. Harrison explained as they walked through hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. "Gardeners, security, kitchen staff, maintenance, and housekeeping. You'll be working primarily in the main house, focusing on the family's living quarters." They passed a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a dining room with a table that could seat 20 people, and several sitting rooms decorated with antique furniture worth more than Elena had earned in her entire working life. The family consists of Mr. Richard Blackwood, the patriarch, though he spends most of his time traveling for business. Mrs. Blackwood passed away 5 years ago. There are 2 children, Marcus, who is 25 and manages several of the family's European operations, and Victoria, who is 23. Mrs. Harrison paused at the bottom of a grand staircase, her expression growing serious. "Ms. Martinez, I must be frank with you. You are the 15th person we've hired for this position in the past 2 years. The previous 14 either quit within days or were dismissed." Elena frowned. "May I ask why?" "Victoria Blackwood is challenging. She has always been headstrong, but since her mother's death, she has become increasingly difficult. She seems to take particular pleasure in making life impossible for household staff, especially those assigned to her wing of the house." Mrs. Harrison led Elena up the staircase, their footsteps muffled by a thick carpet runner. "She has destroyed personal belongings, made unreasonable demands at all hours, refused to allow cleaning of her rooms, and shown complete disrespect for anyone she considers beneath her social standing." They reached the 2nd floor, where the hallway was lined with family portraits and windows overlooking the gardens. "Her behavior has become particularly troublesome since she dropped out of university 6 months ago. She was studying international relations at Harvard, but she left suddenly and has refused to discuss her plans with her father." Elena listened carefully, but she didn't feel intimidated. In her years of working for wealthy families, she had encountered difficult personalities before. Often, she had found that the most challenging people were simply those who had been hurt and didn't know how to express their pain in healthy ways. "Mrs. Harrison, may I ask what approach the previous staff members took with Miss Victoria?" The older woman sighed. "Most tried to avoid her entirely. A few attempted to be overly accommodating, hoping to win her favor. 2 tried to be strict and enforce house rules. None were successful. They stopped in front of a heavy oak door with brass hardware. This is Victoria's wing. She has a bedroom, sitting room, private office, and bathroom. You'll also be responsible for the guest suite at the end of the hall and the small library on this floor. Mrs. Harrison handed Elena a ring of keys. Your quarters are on the 3rd floor, next to the other household staff. Breakfast is served in the staff dining room at 6:30. You'll begin work at 7 each morning. Any questions? When will I meet Miss Victoria? She rarely rises before noon and spends most of her time either in her rooms or somewhere on the property. You may not encounter her immediately, which might be for the best. Use today to familiarize yourself with your duties and the layout of this wing. After Mrs. Harrison left, Elena stood alone in the hallway, studying the door to Victoria's wing. She could hear faint music coming from within, something classical and melancholy. She knocked gently, waited a moment, then used her key to enter. The first thing that struck her was the chaos. The sitting room looked as though a tornado had swept through it. Books were scattered across the floor, magazines torn and thrown about, cushions pulled from chairs and left in random piles. Empty coffee cups and plates with remnants of food sat on every surface, some growing mold. The expensive furniture was covered in dust, and the air smelled stale and unpleasant. Elena set her bag down and surveyed the damage. She had seen mess before, but this was different. This wasn't carelessness or laziness. This looked like anger, like someone had deliberately destroyed their own living space in a fit of rage or despair. She moved carefully through the sitting room, stepping over books and debris, and peered into the bedroom. It was even worse. Clothes were everywhere, expensive designer items mixed with casual wear in piles that reached her knees. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted and hanging off the mattress. More dishes, more cups, and what appeared to be the remains of several meals were scattered about. But what caught Elena's attention most was the wall beside the bed. It was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all featuring a beautiful woman with kind eyes and Victoria's distinctive dark hair. This had to be Mrs. Blackwood, Victoria's mother. Many of the photos showed mother and daughter together, laughing, traveling, attending social events. They looked incredibly close, sharing the same bright smile and expressive eyes. Elena understood immediately. This wasn't just rebellious behavior from a spoiled rich girl. This was grief, raw and unprocessed, expressed in the only way Victoria knew how. She spent the rest of the morning quietly cleaning the sitting room, working methodically to restore order without disturbing anything that seemed particularly personal or meaningful. She didn't throw away any of the books, even the ones that had been damaged, and she carefully collected the scattered photographs, placing them in a neat stack on the desk. Around noon, she heard movement from the bedroom, followed by the sound of running water. Victoria was awake. Elena continued her work, humming softly to herself as she dusted and organized. 20 minutes later, the bedroom door opened, and Elena got her first look at Victoria Blackwood. The young woman was undeniably beautiful, with long dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders and striking green eyes that currently held a mixture of surprise and annoyance. She was tall and slender, wearing an oversized sweater and expensive jeans that probably cost more than Elena made in a month. But there was something fragile about her, a vulnerability that her defensive posture couldn't quite hide. "Who are you?" Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the crisp accent of private schools and European tutors. "What are you doing in my room?" Elena straightened up, meeting the young woman's gaze calmly. "I'm Elena Martinez, the new housekeeper. Mrs. Harrison assigned me to this wing." Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation. "I didn't ask for a new housekeeper. I specifically told Mrs. Harrison that I didn't want anyone disturbing my things." "I haven't disturbed anything," Elena replied gently. "I've only cleaned what was clearly trash and organized items that had fallen on the floor. Your personal belongings are exactly where you left them." Victoria looked around the sitting room, clearly surprised by how much better it looked without actually being changed. Her eyes fell on the stack of photographs Elena had carefully collected. "You touched my photos," she said, her voice carrying a warning, "only to move them to safety. They were scattered on the floor where they might have been damaged. I thought you'd want them protected." For a moment, Victoria's hostile expression softened, but she quickly caught herself and rebuilt her defenses. I don't care what you thought. I want you out of my room. Now. Elena nodded respectfully. Of course. I'll come back later to finish, if that's all right. It's not all right. I don't want you back at all. Find somewhere else to clean. Elena gathered her cleaning supplies calmly. I understand you're upset, but this is my job. Mrs. Harrison has assigned me to maintain this wing, and I intend to do my work properly. However, I'm happy to work around your schedule so I don't disturb you. Victoria stared at her in apparent shock. Clearly, she wasn't used to staff members who didn't immediately back down when she raised her voice. Did you not hear me? I said I don't want you here. I heard you, Elena said quietly. But running away from problems doesn't solve them. Trust me, I know. Something in Elena's tone must have surprised Victoria, because she didn't immediately respond with another angry outburst. Instead, she studied the older woman's face with curiosity. Elena took advantage of the moment of silence. I'll be in the guest suite down the hall if you need anything. And Miss Victoria? Your mother was very beautiful. You have her eyes. Before Victoria could respond, Elena left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. She spent the afternoon cleaning the guest suite and the small library, working efficiently while thinking about her encounter with Victoria Blackwood. The young woman was clearly intelligent, articulate, and capable of controlling herself when she chose to. Her anger wasn't random or meaningless. It was directed and purposeful, a way of keeping people at a distance while she processed her grief. Elena had been 17 when her own mother died, and she remembered the rage that had consumed her. The difference was that Elena had been forced to channel that anger into survival. She'd had to work, to support herself, to function in the world whether she wanted to or not. Victoria had the luxury of falling apart without consequences, which meant she'd never learned healthier ways to cope with her pain. Around 4 o'clock, Elena heard Victoria's door open and close, followed by footsteps moving down the hall toward the main staircase. She waited a few minutes, then returned to Victoria's sitting room to finish her work. The bedroom door was closed, but the sitting room was exactly as Elena had left it. She completed her cleaning quietly and efficiently, paying special attention to the windows to let in more natural light.
Please, miss, there's no need for that. I won't be told what to do.
And welcoming while still maintaining Victoria's personal touches. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a small framed photograph that had fallen behind the desk. It showed Victoria and her mother at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony, both women beaming with pride and joy. Elena carefully placed the photo on the desk where Victoria would be sure to see it. That evening, Elena ate dinner with the other staff members in the kitchen. She listened to their conversations about Victoria, noting the mixture of frustration, sympathy, and resignation in their voices. She wasn't always like this, said Margaret, one of the older housekeepers. Before Mrs. Blackwood died, Victoria was lovely, polite, considerate, always had a kind word for everyone. But grief changes people. It's been 5 years, pointed out James, the groundskeeper. At some point, she needs to move on. Elena shook her head. Grief doesn't follow a timeline. Everyone processes loss differently. Some people need more time to find their way through it. Well, I hope you have better luck than the others, Margaret said. That poor girl is destroying herself, and she's taking everyone around her down with her. Elena went to bed that night thinking about Victoria, about the pain hidden behind her angry exterior, and about the photographs that showed how close she had been to her mother. Tomorrow, she decided, she would try a different approach. The next morning, Elena arrived at Victoria's wing with her usual cleaning supplies and something extra, a thermos of freshly brewed coffee and a small plate of homemade pastries she'd made early that morning in the staff kitchen. She knocked on the sitting room door and waited. When there was no answer, she used her key to enter. Victoria was awake, sitting in the window seat with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the gardens. She wore the same clothes as the day before, and her hair was even more tangled. I brought coffee, Elena said simply, setting the thermos and pastries on the small table near the window. And some breakfast, if you're hungry. Victoria turned to look at her with suspicion. Why? Because you look like you could use both. I told you I didn't want you here. Elena began her cleaning routine, moving around Victoria without making her feel crowded or pressured. You did. But I'm here anyway. Sometimes we don't get what we want. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, watching Elena work. Finally, she spoke. The others always acted afraid of me, like I was going to explode at any moment. Are you going to explode? Maybe. Elena smiled slightly. I've survived explosions before. I think I can handle it. Victoria reached for the thermos of coffee, inhaling the rich aroma before taking a tentative sip. Her eyes closed in apparent pleasure. This is good. Really good. My grandmother's recipe. She always said that coffee should be strong enough to wake the dead and smooth enough to comfort the living. Where are you from? Victoria asked, her voice losing some of its defensive edge. Originally, a small town in New Mexico. But I've lived all over the country, working for different families. Victoria picked at one of the pastries, clearly hungry despite her pretense of disinterest. Why do you do this kind of work? Elena paused in her dusting to consider the question. Because I'm good at taking care of people and places. There's satisfaction in making order out of chaos, in creating spaces where people can feel comfortable and safe. Even when those people treat you badly, especially then, people usually treat others badly when they're hurting. Taking care of them is just another way of taking care of the hurt. Victoria was quiet for a long time after that, sipping her coffee and watching Elena work. The older woman moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something gentle and unhurried about her approach that seemed to ease the tension in the room. When Elena finished cleaning, she gathered her supplies but left the thermos and the remaining pastries. I'll be back tomorrow, she said. Same time. I might not be here. Elena paused at the door. That's all right. The coffee will keep. Over the next several days, a pattern emerged. Elena would arrive each morning with coffee and some small offering of food, often homemade items that filled the room with warm, comforting smells. Victoria would initially protest her presence, but her resistance was becoming more half-hearted with each passing day. Gradually, Victoria began to engage in brief conversation. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning during Elena's second week at the Blackwood estate. She arrived at Victoria's wing as usual, carrying her thermos of coffee and a plate of warm blueberry muffins, only to find Victoria sitting on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by open boxes and scattered papers. Tears streamed down her face as she held what appeared to be a handwritten letter. Elena set down her supplies and knelt beside the younger woman, not speaking, simply offering her presence. Victoria looked up with red, swollen eyes, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. I found them, Victoria whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. All of her letters. She wrote me one for every birthday until I turned 30. I was supposed to get them from her lawyer, but I've been too angry to see him. Elena glanced at the scattered papers and saw elegant handwriting covering page after page of expensive stationery. She wanted to make sure you'd still have her guidance, even after she was gone. Victoria laughed bitterly. Guidance? What kind of guidance? How to be the perfect daughter of a billionaire. How to smile and look pretty at charity galas. How to marry the right man and produce the next generation of Blackwood heirs. Is that what the letters say? Victoria picked up one of the papers, her hands shaking. No, that's the problem. Listen to this. She cleared her throat and began to read. My dearest Victoria, on your 24th birthday, I hope you're living your life on your own terms. I know your father, and I raised you in a world of expectations and obligations, but I want you to know that your happiness matters more to me than any family legacy or social standing. Follow your heart, even if it leads you away from everything we planned for you. Elena listened quietly as Victoria continued reading. She talks about traveling to places that aren't safe or fashionable, about working jobs that matter instead of just making money, about falling in love with someone who makes you laugh instead of someone who looks good on paper. Victoria's voice cracked. She says she wishes she'd been braver, that she'd shown me how to live authentically instead of just teaching me how to meet other people's expectations. The rain continued to patter against the windows as Victoria read excerpts from several letters. Each one revealed a side of Mrs. Blackwood that Elena suspected few people had known, a woman who had questioned the constraints of her privileged life and wanted something different for her daughter. She knew, Victoria said finally. She knew I was miserable at Harvard, Knew I was just going through the motions of being the person everyone expected me to be. But she died before I could tell her how lost I felt, before I could ask her how to be myself in a world that wants me to be someone else. Elena reached for Victoria's hand, noting how cold and thin it felt. She knew because she felt the same way. That's why she wrote these letters, to give you permission to be yourself. But I don't even know who that is anymore, Victoria admitted. I've spent so long being what other people wanted that I'm not sure what I actually want. And now everyone thinks I'm just a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum because I didn't get my way. Elena looked around at the chaos of the bedroom, understanding it now in a completely different light. This isn't a tantrum. This is grief. You've been mourning not just your mother, but the relationship you never got to have with her, the conversations you never got to finish. Victoria nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I was so angry at her for leaving before I could tell her the truth about how I felt. And then, I was angry at myself for being angry at someone who was dead. It felt easier to be angry at everyone else instead. Elena helped Victoria gather the letters carefully, treating each piece of paper like the precious artifact it was. Anger is just love with nowhere to go. Your mother knew you loved her, Victoria. These letters prove that she understood you better than you think. Over the next several hours, Victoria read through more of her mother's letters while Elena quietly cleaned around her. The letters revealed a woman who had struggled with her own sense of purpose and identity, who had married into wealth and status but had never stopped dreaming of a more meaningful life. She wanted to start a foundation, Victoria said during a break from reading. Not just another charity that rich people use to make themselves feel better, but something that actually made a difference. She writes about visiting homeless shelters and women's refuges, about seeing problems that money could solve if it was spent wisely. Elena looked up from folding laundry. Did she ever start it? No. She got sick before she could make it happen. But she talks about it in every letter, like it was her biggest regret. Victoria held up a letter dated for her 20th birthday. Listen to this. I hope you'll find a way to use our family's resources for something meaningful. Money is only valuable if it improves lives, and I failed to teach you that by example. That afternoon, Victoria emerged from her bedroom for the first time in weeks, wearing clean clothes and with her hair brushed. She found Elena in the sitting room, organizing the books that had been scattered across the floor. Elena, can I ask you something? Of course. Victoria sat down in one of the newly cleaned chairs, looking nervous. What would you do if you had unlimited money but felt like your life had no purpose? Elena considered the question carefully. I think I'd start by figuring out what problems in the world made me angry or sad. Then, I'd use the money to try to solve them. But how do you know if you're actually helping or just making yourself feel better? You get your hands dirty. You don't just write checks, you show up. You listen to the people you're trying to help and let them tell you what they need instead of assuming you know. Victoria was quiet for several minutes, turning this idea over in her mind. My mother's letters mentioned specific places she visited, shelters, and community centers in the city. I wonder if they're still operating. Elena smiled. There's one way to find out. That evening, Victoria did something she hadn't done in months. She called her father. Richard Blackwood was in his London office when his assistant transferred the call. Victoria could hear the surprise in his voice when he answered. Victoria? Is everything all right? Mrs. Harrison said you'd hired a new housekeeper, but that you were still keeping to yourself. I'm fine, Dad. Better than I've been in a while. I wanted to ask you about Mom's charity work. The visits she made to shelters and community centers. Do you remember the details? There was a long pause. Your mother never talked to me much about those visits. She said I wouldn't understand, and honestly, I didn't try very hard to. Why do you ask? Victoria took a deep breath. I found her letters. The ones she wrote for my birthdays. She talks about wanting to start a foundation, about using our money to actually help people instead of just attending galas, and writing checks to causes we never really understood. Victoria, I know you're going through a difficult time, but I hope you're not considering any rash decisions. The family has established charitable commitments, and Dad. Victoria interrupted gently. I'm not talking about being rash. I'm talking about finding a purpose. Mom wanted to do meaningful work, and she never got the chance. Maybe I can do it for her. When Victoria hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of direction. For the first time since her mother's death, she had an idea of how she wanted to spend her life. The next morning, she asked Elena to help her transform her bedroom from a disaster zone into a functional space where she could work and think clearly. Together, they sorted through months of accumulated clutter, washing clothes, organizing books, and creating order from chaos. As they worked, Victoria talked about her plans. "I want to visit the places Mom went, see what they need, understand what kind of help would actually make a difference. But I don't want to show up as Richard Blackwood's daughter with a checkbook. I want to earn their trust first." Elena paused in her folding of laundry. "That's wise. Trust has to be built slowly. The problem is, I don't know anything about the real world. I've lived in this bubble my entire life. I've never had a real job, never had to worry about money or housing or any of the things that normal people deal with every day." Elena sat down on the edge of the bed, studying Victoria's face. "You could learn. If you really wanted to understand how most people live, you could start by living like them." Victoria looked intrigued. "What do you mean?" "Get a regular job. Not as Victoria Blackwood, the billionaire's daughter, but as Victoria Martinez or Victoria Johnson, just another young woman trying to make her way in the world. Rent a small apartment, work for minimum wage, figure out how to pay bills, and buy groceries on a tight budget." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating to Victoria. She'd never been without the safety net of her family's wealth, never had to worry about whether she could afford rent or food or medical care. "How would I even start? I don't have any real skills." Elena smiled. "Everyone has skills. You speak 3 languages fluently. You have excellent organizational abilities. You're educated and intelligent. You could work in retail, food service, office administration. The point isn't to suffer, it's to understand." Over the next few days, Victoria threw herself into research with the same intensity she'd once brought to her studies. She spent hours online, learning about minimum wage jobs, apartment rentals, and the realities of working-class life. She read blogs and forums where people discussed their struggles to make ends meet, their fears about unexpected expenses, their difficult choices between necessities. Elena helped by sharing stories from her own life, explaining how she'd learned to budget, how she'd found affordable housing, how she'd dealt with periods of unemployment. Victoria listened with fascination and growing respect for the challenges that most people faced every day. "I want to do this," Victoria announced one morning as Elena arrived with coffee. "I want to get a job and an apartment and see what it's really like. But I'll need help. I don't even know how to look for apartments or apply for jobs." Elena set down her supplies and looked at Victoria seriously. "Are you sure? It won't be easy. You'll be giving up comfort, convenience, and security. You'll have to work harder than you've ever worked, for less money than you spend on shoes." "I'm sure. But I can't do it alone. Elena, would you consider leaving here and helping me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I trust you, and I don't think I can figure this out by myself." Elena was quiet for a long moment. The offer was tempting in many ways. She'd grown genuinely fond of Victoria and was invested in her growth and healing. But leaving a stable, well-paying position to help a billionaire's daughter play at being poor seemed risky at best. "What about your father? Your family's expectations? Your inheritance?" Victoria had clearly thought about this. "I'll tell Dad I'm taking a gap year to figure out what I want to do with my life. Technically, it's true. As for my inheritance, it will still be there when I'm ready for it. If I'm ever ready for it. And what about me? What happens to my job if this experiment doesn't work out?" Victoria looked embarrassed. "I'd make sure you were taken care of financially, of course. And if you wanted to come back here, I'd talk to Mrs. Harrison about holding your position. But, Elena, I think this could work. I think it could change everything." Elena looked around at the beautiful, clean room they'd created together, at the young woman who had transformed from an angry, broken girl into someone with purpose and determination. She thought about her own life, about the routine she'd fallen into, about the opportunity to be part of something meaningful instead of just maintaining the status quo. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this properly. No safety nets, no calling Daddy when things get tough, no using your connections to make things easier. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Victoria's face lit up with a smile that reminded Elena powerfully of the photographs of Mrs. Blackwood. "Really? You'll help me. I'll help you. But first, we need to plan this carefully. You'll need a new identity, a believable background, and a complete understanding of what you're getting into. They spent the next week creating Victoria's new persona. She would be Victoria Martinez, Elena's niece, who had recently moved to the city after finishing community college. Elena would be her aunt, helping her get established. They practiced Victoria's cover story until it felt natural, and Elena coached her on everything from how to dress for job interviews to how to behave in entry-level positions. Victoria's first job interview was at a small coffee shop called Billionaire, located 3 blocks from their new apartment. She had practiced her story dozens of times with Elena, but as she stood outside the shop's glass door, her hands were shaking with nervousness. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Sandra in her 40s, looked Victoria up and down skeptically. Says here you just finished community college. What did you study? General studies with a focus on communications, Victoria replied, sticking to the script she and Elena had developed. I'm interested in working with people and building customer relationships. Sandra raised an eyebrow. That's a fancy way to say you want to serve coffee. Have you ever worked in food service before? No, but I'm a quick learner, and I'm willing to start at the bottom and work my way up. The interview lasted 20 minutes, during which Sandra explained the long hours, difficult customers, and physical demands of the job. The pay was minimum wage, with no benefits for part-time employees. Victoria would be expected to work early morning shifts, weekend hours, and holidays. I can start whenever you need me, Victoria said. Sandra studied her carefully. You seem awfully eager for someone who's never worked in a coffee shop. Most college kids think this kind of work is beneath them. Victoria thought about her mother's letters, about the women in homeless shelters who worked multiple jobs just to survive. I don't think any honest work is beneath anyone. I want to learn what it's like to earn my own way. Something in Victoria's tone must have convinced Sandra, because she offered Victoria a part-time position starting the following Monday. Victoria walked home with her first job, feeling prouder than she had when she'd been accepted to Harvard. Elena was waiting in their small kitchen, cooking dinner on their second-hand stove. The apartment smelled like garlic and onions, simple but comforting. Victoria burst through the door with a huge smile. I got it. I start Monday morning at 6 o'clock. Elena hugged her tightly. Congratulations. How do you feel? Terrified and excited. Sandra seems tough, but fair. And Elena, the other employees I met seemed so real. They weren't pretending to be anything other than exactly who they are. That weekend, Victoria prepared for her new life with the same intensity she'd once brought to preparing for finals. She practiced using the coffee machines at a nearby shop, researched different types of coffee beans and brewing methods, and bought comfortable shoes designed for standing long hours. Monday morning came earlier than Victoria had ever experienced. Her alarm went off at 5 o'clock, and she stumbled to the kitchen where Elena had already prepared coffee and toast. Remember, Elena said as Victoria gathered her things, your job is to serve customers well, learn from your coworkers, and prove that you're reliable. Don't try to fix everything on your first day. The coffee shop was already busy when Victoria arrived, filled with commuters grabbing their morning caffeine before work. Sandra introduced her to the other employees. Miguel, a college student studying engineering, Sarah, a single mother working 2 jobs, and Tom, a retired teacher who worked part-time to supplement his pension. Victoria's first shift was overwhelming. The coffee machines were more complicated than she'd expected, the orders came faster than she could process them, and she spilled more drinks than she successfully made. By 10 o'clock, she was exhausted, sweaty, and beginning to understand why Sandra had seemed skeptical about her eagerness. First day, asked a customer, a construction worker who was waiting patiently for Victoria to figure out how to make his cappuccino. Is it that obvious? He smiled kindly. We've all been there. You'll get the hang of it. That simple encouragement meant more to Victoria than all the praise she'd received for academic achievements. This man didn't know who her father was or how much money her family had. He was being kind simply because she was a fellow human being trying to do her job. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Victoria's life. She worked 30 hours a week at Billionaire, which left her constantly tired but oddly satisfied. Her hands, which had never done manual labor, developed calluses from handling hot cups and cleaning equipment. Her feet ached from standing all day, and she fell into bed each night completely exhausted. But she was learning things they'd never taught at Harvard. She learned how to work efficiently under pressure, how to stay patient with difficult customers, how to be part of a team where everyone had to pull their weight. She learned the difference between people who treated service workers with respect and those who didn't, and she began to understand the daily humiliations that came with working in a job that society considered low-skilled. "You're getting good at this," Miguel told her after she'd been working for 3 weeks. "Sandra was worried you wouldn't last a week, but you've really improved." Victoria felt a surge of pride. Miguel's approval meant more to her than any grade she'd ever received, because it was based on her actual performance rather than her family connections or potential. During her lunch breaks, Victoria would walk through the neighborhood, observing the community she was now part of. She saw the struggle in ways she'd never noticed before. The elderly woman who counted out exact change for her coffee because every penny mattered. The single father who brought his children to the shop after school because he couldn't afford childcare. The college students who split one pastry between them because it was all they could afford. At home, she and Elena would discuss Victoria's experiences over simple dinners of pasta and vegetables, foods that fit their careful budget. Elena shared stories of her own working life, helping Victoria understand the broader context of what she was experiencing. "The hardest part," Elena explained, "isn't the physical work or even the low pay. It's the way some people treat you, like you're invisible or stupid just because of your job." Victoria nodded, remembering a customer from that morning who had snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog, becoming angry when she didn't immediately understand his complex order. But the good customers make up for it, don't they? Like Mrs. Chun, who always asks about my day and tips well. Or the teacher who brings his students sometimes and makes sure they say please and thank you. Exactly. You learn to appreciate genuine kindness because you see how rare it is. After 6 weeks at being there, Victoria had saved enough money for her first major purchase, a bus pass that would allow her to explore more of the city. She began spending her days off visiting the neighborhoods and organizations her mother had written about in her letters. Her first stop was the downtown women's shelter, a converted warehouse that provided temporary housing for homeless women and their children. Victoria walked through the front door nervously, unsure of what to expect. The lobby was clean but worn, with donated furniture and inspirational posters covering scuffed walls. A woman behind the reception desk looked up with a welcoming smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm interested in volunteering," Victoria said. "I work part-time and have some free hours during the week." The woman, whose name tag read Marie, handed Victoria a clipboard with volunteer application forms. "What kind of work are you interested in?" "We need help with everything from childcare to meal preparation to administrative tasks." Victoria filled out the forms honestly, listing her current job and address. When Marie reviewed her application, she seemed pleased to find someone local who was already working and wanted to volunteer additional time. "Most of our volunteers are college students doing community service requirements or wealthy people who come once a month to feel good about themselves," Marie explained. "It's nice to meet someone from the neighborhood who wants to make a real commitment." Victoria started volunteering 2 afternoons a week, helping in the children's playroom while mothers attended job training sessions or met with social workers. The children ranged in age from toddlers to teenagers, all dealing with the trauma and instability of homelessness. The first child who really connected with Victoria was a 6-year-old girl named Destiny, whose mother was trying to escape an abusive relationship. Destiny was quiet and watchful, clearly intelligent, but struggling to trust the adults in her constantly changing world. "Do you have kids at home?" Destiny asked Victoria one afternoon as they worked on a puzzle together. "No, I don't. Do you think I'd be a good mom?" Destiny considered this seriously. "Maybe. You're nice, but not fake nice. And you don't talk to me like I'm stupid." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes at the casual way Destiny revealed how often adults condescended to her. "You're very smart, Destiny. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Through her work at the shelter, Victoria met women from all walks of life who had ended up homeless for reasons ranging from domestic violence to medical bankruptcy to job loss. She listened to their stories, learned about the barriers they faced in finding stable housing and employment, and began to understand how easily anyone could fall through society's safety nets. One evening, she came home to find Elena reading a newspaper article about the Blackwood Foundation's latest charity gala, where wealthy donors had raised money for various causes over expensive dinner and dancing. Your family's foundation donated $50,000 to homeless services, Elena reported. The article says it was a record-breaking night of giving. Victoria looked at the photographs of elegantly dressed people holding champagne glasses and smiling for cameras. 6 months ago, she would have been in one of those photos, wearing a designer dress and feeling good about her family's generosity. $50,000, she repeated slowly. That's a lot of money. It is. It could fund the children's program at the shelter for 6 months. Victoria was quiet for a moment. But it could also fund it for 12 months if they didn't spend $30,000 on flowers and catering for the gala. Elena smiled. You're starting to think differently about money. I'm starting to think differently about everything. Elena, I've learned more in the past 2 months than I learned in 4 years of college. But I'm also starting to understand something else. What's that? Victoria sat down across from Elena at their small kitchen table. I can't help people effectively from the bottom of the economic ladder any more than I could help them from the top. Working at minimum wage has taught me what that life is like, but it doesn't give me the resources to make real change. Elena nodded. You're right. The question is, what do you want to do with that knowledge? Victoria had been thinking about this question for weeks. I want to start the foundation my mother dreamed of, but I want to do it right. I want to hire people like Marie who understand the problems because they've lived them or worked directly with them. I want to focus on solutions that actually work instead of just making donors feel good. That sounds like a good plan. But first, you need to finish what you started here. You made commitments to being there and the shelter. Honor those before you move on to something bigger. Victoria agreed, and over the next month, she threw herself into both her job and volunteer work with renewed purpose. She watched Sandra manage the coffee shop, learning about small business challenges and employee management. She observed the shelter's operations, understanding how nonprofit organizations functioned and where they struggled with limited resources. During this time, she also began reconnecting with her father, calling him weekly to share what she was learning. Richard Blackwood was initially skeptical of his daughter's reports about minimum wage work and homeless shelters, but he gradually began to hear something new in her voice, genuine passion and purpose. You sound different, he told her during one of their conversations. More focused, more like your mother when she found something she cared about. I am different, Dad. I finally understand what Mom was trying to tell me in those letters. Money isn't just a tool for buying things or maintaining status. It's a responsibility. After 3 months of working and volunteering, Victoria felt ready to take the next step. She had saved enough money to prove to herself that she could survive on her own income, and she had gained the real-world experience she needed to understand the problems she wanted to solve. Her last day at Bean there was emotional. Sandra, who had become something of a mentor, pulled her aside during her final shift. I don't know what your real story is, Sandra said, but I know you're not just some college kid trying to find herself. You've worked harder than anyone I've hired in years, and you've treated everyone with respect. Whatever you do next, you'll be good at it. Victoria hugged her goodbye, feeling genuine sadness at leaving people who had become important to her. That evening, she and Elena sat in their small apartment, surrounded by the possessions they'd accumulated during their months of ordinary living. Victoria felt different than she had when they'd first moved in, more grounded and confident, with a clearer sense of who she was and what she wanted to accomplish. Are you ready to go back? Elena asked gently. Victoria looked around at the apartment that had become her first real home, the place where she discovered who she could be when stripped of wealth and privilege. I'm ready to go forward, she said. I'm ready to become the person my mother hoped I'd be. The next morning, Victoria picked up the phone and called her father. Dad, it's time. I'm ready to come home and start the real work. Richard Blackwood's voice was warm with relief and pride. Welcome back, Victoria. I've missed you, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand what you've been trying to accomplish. I hope so, Dad, because I'm going to need your help. I want to start a foundation, but not like the charity work our family has done before. I want to create something that actually changes lives, and I know exactly how to do it." As Victoria began planning her return to the world of wealth and privilege, she carried with her the lessons learned from calloused hands, aching feet, and genuine human connections forged in the ordinary struggles of working life. She had discovered not just who she was, but who she could become, and she was ready to honor both her mother's memory and her own hard-won wisdom by building something meaningful from the ground up. For Victoria donated most of her expensive clothes to charity, keeping only a few conservative outfits appropriate for job hunting. She learned to do her own laundry, to cook simple meals, to budget for groceries and utilities. The most difficult part was telling her father. Richard Blackwood was not pleased with his daughter's plan to disappear into the working world, even temporarily. "Victoria, this is ridiculous. If you want to help people, we can expand the family's charitable giving. You don't need to pretend to be someone you're not." "But that's exactly the problem, Dad. I don't know who I am. I've been living someone else's version of my life for so long that I've lost myself completely. Mom's letters made me realize that I want to do something meaningful, but I can't help people I don't understand." The conversation ended with Richard reluctantly agreeing to give Victoria 6 months to get this out of her system, as he put it. He made her promise to check in regularly and to call if she needed anything. Mrs. Harrison was sorry to see Elena go, but understanding about her decision. "That girl needs you more than we do," she said. "I hope you can help her find her way." On a crisp October morning, Elena and Victoria loaded their belongings into Elena's old Honda Civic and drove away from the Blackwood estate. Victoria looked back at the mansion through the rear window, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement about the journey ahead. They had rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood across town. The space was tiny compared to Victoria's wing at the mansion, with thin walls, outdated appliances, and a view of the parking lot instead of manicured gardens. But it was clean and affordable, and it would be theirs. As they carried boxes up 2 flights of stairs, Victoria realized she was happier than she'd been in years. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she was moving toward something instead of just running away from pain. The real test, though, would begin the next morning, when Victoria Martinez would start looking for her first real job. Ions. She asked about Elena's previous jobs, about the places she'd lived, about her family. Elena answered honestly, but didn't pry in return, allowing Victoria to share only what she felt comfortable revealing. By the end of the first week, Victoria was getting up earlier, sometimes even beating Elena to the sitting room. The bedroom remained largely untouched, still chaotic and unkempt, but the sitting room was beginning to feel like a livable space again. Elena noticed other changes too. Victoria was eating more regularly, taking longer showers, and spending time reading instead of just staring out the window. The angry outbursts that had characterized her interactions with previous staff members had all but disappeared. But Elena knew they were still in the early stages of building trust. The real test would come when Victoria felt safe enough to let her guard down completely, to share the depth of her pain, and begin the real work of healing. That opportunity came sooner than Elena expected, in a way that would challenge everything both women thought they knew about grief, family, and the possibility of starting over.